Hello, BCPS families. We are so excited to share with you a read aloud. This week's story is Mrs. Katz and Tush, written and illustrated by the amazing Patricia Polacco. A special thanks to Penguin Random House for allowing us to read this together today. As you listen to this text, we will stop at times and ask you to think about what is happening. After you finish listening to the story, first we will share some questions with you to think and talk about. Then you will see a writing prompt. You can use this writing prompt to respond to the text. You can then share your written response with your teacher. Finally, you will see some project ideas for enrichment and ways to have fun interacting with books. Enjoy!
Hello, BCPS students and families. I am so excited to share a read aloud with you today by one of my favorite authors and illustrators, Patricia Polacco. This story is called Mrs. Katz and Tush, and it's about two unlikely friends that are brought together by one of my favorite creatures, a little cat. As we read the story today, I want us to focus our attention on theme. Remember, theme is the message or lesson the author is trying to communicate to the reader throughout the story. In this text, the author is not going to come out and give us the theme directly. We are going to have to make inferences throughout the text to help us determine the theme. Authors do give us clues to theme, so as we read the story together today, I'm going to stop periodically and share some clues with you, and we'll see if we can work together to make inferences that will help us determine the theme. I am so excited to present Mrs. Katz and Tush by Patricia Polacco, presented with permission from Penguin Random House. Larnell didn't know Mrs. Katz very well, but almost every other day his mother stopped in to see her after work. Since her husband died, she's so alone, his mother had told him. Mrs. Katz held tight to his mother's hand the day they looked at an old photo album. "That's my husband, Myron," said Mrs. Katz. "He came from Poland like me a long time ago. We had such a life, such a life." Then her voice broke. "We had no children, and I'll be all alone for Hanukkah and Passover." Then she cried. Boys and girls, sometimes authors reveal the theme of the story through the lessons learned by their characters. So to determine these lessons, it's really important that we think about how these characters change over the course of the story. That's going to help us determine the lesson that they learn. What do you already know about Mrs. Katz and Larnell from this page? Well, I know from the picture that Mrs. Katz is an older white lady. She's from Poland. The text tells me that. And she seems very lonely. We also know that she's Jewish because in the text it says she celebrates Hanukkah and Passover, and those are both Jewish holidays. Larnell is on the opposite page, and he looks like a young African-American boy. Maybe he's about 10 or 11 years old. It doesn't seem like these two have very much in common. How do you think Larnell is feeling during this scene in the story? Based on looking at his position in the chair and the expression on his face, I'm thinking that he's feeling awkward and uncomfortable. And I can actually relate to the way Larnell is feeling. I sometimes feel awkward and uncomfortable when I'm around people who I don't have much in common with. I don't know what to say or how to act. Have you ever felt that way? Let's see if this changes as we continue the story. The next day, Larnell stopped in to see her himself. "I've been thinking," he said. "A cat had some kittens in the basement of our building. We found someone to take them all except this one. She's the runt. Nobody wants her because she's so ugly. She doesn't even have a tail." "Ugly, you say?" Mrs. Cat said. "My Myron was ugly too when he was little, but he grew up to be such a person." Mrs. Cat looked at the little kitten. "Scrawny little Bubbler, so small, no tail," she said as she examined the kittens closely. "I don't know," she said doubtfully. Then she saw the look on Larnell's face. "Larnell, I'll take her," she announced, "but only if you'll come and help me with her. I've never had a cat before." Larnell promised. "A good Yiddish name I'll give her," said Mrs. Katz. "Let's see. She has no tail. All you see is a tush. That's it. We'll call her Tush." Little Tush grew healthy and strong. Mrs. Katz cooked for her, brushed her, knitted toys for her, and even read to her. "Such a person," she'd say as she watched Tush play. Mrs. Katz was in love. Larnell kept his promise. He visited Mrs. Katz and Tush every day after school. There was always a fresh baked kugel and a tall glass of milk waiting for him. But as much as he grew to love Tush, he also loved to listen to Mrs. Katz talk about the old country and the way times used to be. "I come from Warsaw. That's in Poland, you know. I came here to work sewing dresses in the garment district for my cousin Moishi. I didn't speak one word of English." "Then how did you talk to people?" asked Larnell. "I didn't," she answered. "A lot I cried in those days, until I met Myron. He asked me to marry him after he tasted my kugel." "I believe that," Larnell said as he ate some. "Myron and I used to vacation in the Catskills, a Borscht resort. You know, a place for Jews to stay." "You mean Jews couldn't stay anywhere they wanted to?" Larnell asked. Mrs. Katz didn't answer. Instead, she went to a trunk and pulled out some old clothes. "My grandma told me about places she couldn't stay either," Larnell said softly. "Larnell, your people and mine are alike, you know. Trouble we've seen. Happiness, too. Great strength we've had. You and I are alike. So much alike. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, the Catskills. We used to dress every Sunday and have a costume ball," said Mrs. Katz. Then she put a record on the record player. It was old and scratched. "You hear that, Larnell?" she said. "That is what we used to dance to. It's a dance from my homeland. Here, I'll show you." They whirled around the room and laughed and giggled. Boys and girls, I want to take a moment to stop and reflect on the characters and think about how they've changed. What are you thinking? Think about Larnell at the beginning of the story. Think about him now. He certainly looks a lot happier than he did in that first scene in that chair. This page also has a very special clue to help us determine theme. Have you studied Notice and Note signposts with your teacher at school? Notice and Note is a close reading strategy that helps readers dig deeper into text. One of the signposts we look for when we're reading text is called Words to the Wiser. This is when an older, wiser character in the story gives advice to another character who's usually younger or less experienced. When this older, wiser character gives advice, as we're reading, we want to stop and take notice of this because this could be really important in helping us determine the theme of the story. What we want to ask ourselves is, what is this life lesson and how might it affect the character? Did you notice a words to the wiser as you were reading? How about when Mrs. Katz says, "Larnell, your people and mine are alike, you know. Trouble we've seen, happiness too, great strength we've had. You and I are alike, so much alike." What is the life lesson there? How might it affect the character? I think what she's saying is that even though we're all different and have different backgrounds and experiences, we have similarities too. How do you think her telling this to Larnell might affect their relationship? Maybe it might bring them closer together? Let's see. As the weeks passed, Larnell spent more and more time with Mrs. Katz. "Since you are almost family to me, Larnell," she said one day, "I want you should come and with me to say Kaddish for my Myron." I know you're not Jewish, but Myron would have liked you. You're such a person, Larnell." At the cemetery, she read from her book. Then she asked Larnell to put a small rock on top of Mr. Katz's headstone. "We do this to remember," she said softly. "Shalom, my Myron," she murmured and wiped the tears from her face. On the way home, she announced, "Kugel! Such a kugel I baked for you today, Larnell." "Hurry, Tush will be worried for us," she said as they walked. When they got home, they called and called for Tush, but she didn't come. They looked everywhere for her. Suddenly, Mrs. Katz gasped. The window to the fire escape was open. "Oh, no," she cried. "I forgot to shut the window before I left. Poor Bubala. She has never been outside." "We'll find her." Larnell tried to reassure her. "She's been acting strange lately," Mrs. Katz said through her tears. "She's been trying to get out, but I was afraid that she would get hit by a car." "I'll find her, Mrs. Katz," Larnell said. "I won't let you down." It was getting dark. First, Mrs. Katz and Larnell looked around their building. Then they went everywhere in the neighborhood. They left notes on doors, telephone poles, and fences. They asked everyone who lived nearby, but no one had seen little Tush. That night it stormed. There was rain, awful, awful rain. Mrs. Katz hardly slept as she thought about her little Kittela. "She's such a person, she whispered. Larnell worried most of the night, too. What will Mrs. Katz do, he thought. "Please, God, bring that little cat back to her," he said softly into his pillow. A loud knock on the front door awoke Mrs. Katz. It was Larnell's father and two neighbors. "Is this yours?" they asked. "My Bubala, little Kittela!" Mrs. Katz exclaimed. "We found her in the back alley, soaking wet and hungry," Mr. Moore said. Thank you, Mrs. Katz said as she took Tush in her arms. After a while, Tush no longer had the least desire to go outside again, but she slept a lot, even when Larnell came over to play with her. "It was at my Aunt Havela's Passover Seder that I met Myron. Did you know that?" Mrs. Katz asked as she looked at Larnell. "What good times they were with lots and lots of family. Now it's just me," she said softly. "Could I have Passover dinner with you?" asked Larnell. "I thought you would never ask," she exclaimed as she hugged him close. "Such a Seder I'll prepare for you." "Passover is a time for good food," Mrs. Katz shouted as they edged their way through the crowd in the deli. "Like your people, my people were slaves too. They lived in a country where they didn't want to be. They wanted freedom so much that they prayed to God to help them. So he sent an angel that brought death and sadness to the houses of our captors. But the angel did not visit the houses of my people." "How did the angel know where the Jews lived?" Larnell asked. "They marked the doors. Then the angel passed over, Larnell. That's why we call this time of celebration Passover." "So, Larnell, we have a big feast to celebrate, but we also remember those who had to suffer so we could be free," Mrs. Katz said. "Part of the dinner is sad, and part of it is happy." As Larnell helped to get out the linens and china, Mrs. Katz said, "You see this tablecloth? This was our wedding chuppah, our canopy. For all these years we have used it for holy days and celebrations." "How come you have so many different dishes?" Larnell asked. "Because some Jews don't eat dairy and meat off the same dishes," she answered. When they sat down to Seder together, Mrs. Katz lit 2 candles and waved her hands over them. She read from her book, said prayers, then smiled and said, "Let the feast begin." They drank red wine and water. They ate bitter herbs, lamb, and chicken. They also had gefilte fish and spicy chopped apples with potato pancakes. "This bread looks like a soda cracker," Larnell exclaimed. "We call it matzah, dear. We eat it at Passover. It's flat because there is no yeast in it, so it doesn't rise." "Larnell, I have hidden one piece of matzah here in the apartment. If you can find it, I have a surprise for you." The surprise was a hand-knit sweater that she had made just for him. The next day, Mrs. Katz yelled out her back window to Larnell's apartment. "Come, quick, already, something wonderful!" Larnell and his mom and dad rushed to her door. The angel of death passed over, but the angel of life didn't. "Mazel tov, Tush. 4 babies. At last, I am a bubby." Bubby is a Yiddish word for grandmother. So finally, Mrs. Katz is saying that she has grandchildren of her own, the little kittens from Tush. As the years passed, Mrs. Katz, Tush, and her descendants became part of Larnell's family. There were graduations, weddings, new babies, and finally a Kaddish. Larnell stood in front of the headstone. He read from her book. He placed a small rock on top of her headstone. Then he, his wife, and their children read the inscription together. "Mrs. Katz, our Bubby, such a person." Whew, I always get goosebumps at the end of that story. How about you? Do you have goosebumps right now? Let's talk about the theme for a second. How have the characters changed? What did they learn? Well, Larnell and Mrs. Katz have definitely gotten very close, and they've become each other's family. Complex text often has multiple themes. Based on what these characters learn in the story, can you think of one theme? One theme that I think that this text explores is the idea that even though we have different experiences and backgrounds, which we want to celebrate and learn about, as people, we are connected by shared human experiences. We all have experienced birth, death, love, celebration, and hardship. And those similarities can bring us together. I hope you enjoyed our time together as much as I did. Please take care of yourself and your friends and your families, and we can't wait to talk to you soon.
Now that you have read the story, let's talk about it. Notice and note. Again and again is another signpost you may have learned about. It's when the author repeats a word or phrase over and over. It usually has special meaning. What phrase did Mrs. Katz repeat again and again throughout the story? What did Mrs. Katz mean when she used the phrase, such a person? Can you think of another theme of the story related to Mrs. Katz's phrase, such a person? How does Larnell respond to Mrs. Katz's loneliness throughout the story? What theme does this illustrate? Now it's your turn to write. Even though we have different experiences and backgrounds, which we should learn about and celebrate, people are connected by shared human experiences. We all have experienced births, death, love, celebration, and hardship. Those similarities can bring us together. Write an essay explaining how the story Mrs. Katz and Tush represents the theme statement above. Be sure to include an example from the beginning, middle, and end of the story that supports the theme statement above. How Larnell changed as a person throughout the story, and what Larnell learned as a result of spending time with Mrs. Katz. Now it's time to have some fun. You can choose from any of the following activities. Throughout the story, Mrs. Katz mentions Hanukkah and Passover as a few of the holidays that she celebrates as a Jew. Research the customs and traditions of these holidays to learn more. Mrs. Katz mentions that she immigrated from Poland. Most families in America immigrated at some point in history. Interview a family member to learn about your family's origins. Ask to see some old photo albums if you can. Most families have unique holiday traditions of their own. Write a personal narrative that recounts a memory you have of celebrating with your family and friends at your favorite holiday. Have fun.